This is one of my favorite passages from the brothers Karamazov. It's from Book 5, Chapter 4. It's part of a longer conversation between the brothers Ivan and Alyosha on the problem of free will and the suffering of children that results from free will. Ivan is talking to Alyosha and talking about why he doesn't believe that the suffering of children can be justified. And I'll quote here from that section. He says, "O Alyosha, I am not blaspheming. I understand, of course, what an upheaval of the universe it will be, when everything in heaven and earth blends in one hymn of praise, and everything that lives and has lived cries aloud, 'Thou art just, O Lord, for thy ways are revealed.' When the mother embraces the fiend who threw her child to the dogs, and all three cry aloud with tears, 'Thou art just, O Lord,' then, of course, the crown of knowledge will be reached, and all will be made clear. But what pulls me up here is that I can't accept that harmony. And while I am on earth, I make haste to take my own measures. You see, Alyosha, perhaps it really may happen that if I live to that moment, or rise again to see it, I, too, perhaps, may cry aloud with the rest, looking at the mother embracing the child's torturer, 'Thou art just, O Lord.' But I don't want to cry aloud then. While there is still time, I hastened to protect myself, and so I renounce the higher harmony altogether. It's not worth the tears of that one tortured child who beat itself on the breast with its little fist and prayed in its stinking outhouse with its unexpiated tears to dear, kind God. It's not worth it. Because those tears are unatoned for. They must be unatoned for, or there can be no harmony." End quote. So, question of why do I love that fragment? Well, like all of the brothers Karamazov, that fragment is part of a much longer conversation. It's very difficult to take any part of this novel in a small part. But I really love that longer conversation, and that fragment to me is the most powerful piece of it. It's something that's difficult to read. I found my voice breaking a little bit even just now as I read it, because it's quite horrifying and very emotional to talk about the torturing of innocent children. But therein comes the power of that piece. It's a very powerful argument that Ivan has made. And although it's not necessarily pleasant to think about, it's something that sticks with you. And so years after I first read that book, that conversation between Ivan and Alyosha on the suffering of children and the problem of free will has stuck with me. And so for that reason, I've chosen that part of the book, even though it's very difficult to read. The next question is, which of the heroes of the Karamazovs do you associate yourself with? Who is more in you, Dmitry, Ivan, and Alyosha? Well, the answer is none of them exactly. The character I most admire is, of course, Alyosha. And Alyosha is the character I would most like to be like, but unfortunately I'm not. I'm not as good as Alyosha. The character maybe I sympathize with the most is Ivan. I sympathize with intellectuals. I wanted to be an intellectual myself when I was younger. I'm not an intellectual. I'm not smart enough to be an intellectual, and I'm not nearly as smart as Ivan. So I have great sympathies with Ivan, maybe admiration for Ivan, but I'm not nearly as smart as he is. Dmitry, on first glance, is not at all like me. I'm very quiet, introverted, not at all like the impetuous Dmitry, and yet I identify with Dmitry to the extent that Dmitry and his father were prisoners of their bad habits. They had bad characteristics or bad habits that they could not break out of. They were trapped by doing irrational things that they knew were bad, but just somehow couldn't stop themselves from doing, like most of Dostoevsky's characters. And that I see in myself all over, not in the same ways as Dmitry, but certainly in different senses. I've found that I have certain bad habits or bad characteristics that I've very much wanted to rid myself of, and have found it that I couldn't, that I kept repeating the bad things over and over again, even though I very much wanted to stop. And so in that sense, I identify with Dmitry. So I guess a little bit of each of them. Question 4, and which is more in modern society today, in your opinion? Which of Dostoevsky's characters do you meet most often? Well, unfortunately, the answer is not Alyosha. Alyosha is a character it would be very nice if we did meet more of him, but the world is full of Ivans and Dmitrys. In my circle, where I've been a student and a teacher and a reader, I've most often found people who resembled Ivan. But there are a lot of Dmitrys out there in the world as well, and I think it just depends maybe which circles you hang out with. Question 5, the main question of the novel: there is a God or there is no God. How would you respond to it? Well, that is the million-dollar question. And that is a question I have struggled with all of my adult life. I was raised a Christian, but I now consider myself an agnostic because I don't think that there is enough evidence to say that there is a God. And yet the question of whether or not there is a God is the ultimate philosophical question. Everything else in human existence is dependent upon that one question of where did we come from? Why are we here? What happens to us after we die? So I think all humans are searching for the answer to that question. And I don't have that answer. As far as the novel goes, I was somewhat surprised when I read this novel because given Dostoevsky's reputation as a deeply religious man, I was expecting this novel to come down heavily on the side of there is a God. But the novel is actually balanced. Ivan's view that there is no God gets equal time with Alyosha's view that there is a God. And in fact, Ivan makes several pointed arguments that are not rebuffed successfully by Alyosha and are nowhere rebuffed in the book. The question of the suffering of children being the quote I just read from, being one of them. On the other hand, there is an argument for the existence of God. I think there's two arguments in the book. One argument is an argument for morality, namely Ivan's assertion that if there is no God, then everything is permissible. So the question to the reader then is everything permissible? And if the reader decides that everything is not permissible, if there are morals in this life, then that's meant as a refutation of Ivan's argument that there is no God. Many people have debated whether or not morality is possible without God. And it's not a question that I'm going to attempt to give a definitive answer to. other than to acknowledge that there have been many arguments on the atheist or secular side that morality is possible without God. And there have been many arguments on the religious side that morality is not possible without God. And I do not propose to be able to put the final word on that argument, other than to say that Dostoevsky's book, The Brothers Karamazov, is a book that makes you think about that question. And for that, I think it has value. And that leads me into the next question. It says, Dostoevsky was very religious in his books. There is no such thing in modern society. Maybe it's outdated. Why read it today? So I think actually there are several answers to that question. The first answer is that arguably it's not outdated. I think there are many parts of the world that are still very religious today. It's true that Europe is not as religious as it was 150 years ago. But the United States is still, in many areas, a deeply religious nation. Ireland is still very religious. Most of Latin America is still very religious. There are many areas of the world which are still very religious. And obviously, for those areas of the world, Dostoevsky's religious themes will have resonance. But for the rest of us, for those of us who are atheists or agnostic or who live in the secular parts of the world, what value does this book have? Well, I think it has. I think it has a number of values. One value is I think it's possible to separate the religious question from the cosmological or metaphysical question to the sociological question. So the metaphysical or the cosmological question being, what is the universe? How did the universe get here? What's going to happen to us after we die? Those are questions that once you reject religion, I think religious answers no longer have any relevance. But then the other question is about morality. How do we organize ourselves as a society? How do we treat one another? And in this aspect, I think the brothers Karamazov has at points Dostoevsky's attempt to show what Christian love and mercy could be like through the character of Alyosha and his elder, what was the name of the elder? The elder's name was Zosima. Alyosha and his elder and the monks show examples of people who are full of mercy, full of love for one another, and the way that society possibly could be organized if we were filled with love for other human beings and showed mercy to them. Now, there's a question of whether the secular society can still fulfill this teaching of showing love and showing mercy, or whether this is something that needs to come from a religious teaching. And if it needs to come from a religious teaching, then I think Dostoevsky's books have value, or at the very least, it raises the question of whether or not we as a society need the religion. But the other thing I think that there's a lot of value in Dostoevsky's books, and this is true, I think, of everything by Dostoevsky, or at most things. The Brothers Karamazov, Crime and Punishment, which I have here, The Underground Man. All of Dostoevsky's books show people who are trapped in their own sinful nature. They very much want to break free of their sin. They want to be good people, and they want to get rid of this sin or these bad things that they keep repeating, but they are powerless to do so. Now, my reading of human nature is that this is very true. I myself feel like I'm often powerless to break away from the bad habits I've gotten myself into. I know several people who keep repeating the bad things even though they want to stop it. And I think Dostoevsky's psychological portrait of the human condition, where we are trapped doing the bad things that we don't want to do, but feel so powerless to break that cycle, still has a lot of value, even in a secular society. Question 7. In Russia, Dostoevsky is considered a complex and depressing writer. And in your country, how is the novel Karamazovs perceived in your country? What is important in the novel for the Western reader? Well, my country is America, and yes, the perception is very similar in America. Dostoevsky has a reputation as a complex and depressing writer, and also a very great writer. The brothers Karamazov, when I was in university, was called by my literature professors as the greatest novel of all time. Now, that's obviously a subjective opinion that is not shared by everybody in America, but I think it's not a rare opinion. It's very common to find literature professors in universities in America, and ordinary readers like myself who believe that this is the best novel of all time. It also does have a reputation as being depressing and complex. Although, in my own experience, I found Dostoevsky to be very readable. His ideas are complex, but his prose is not opaque. And I'm thinking maybe of some of the modernist writers like T.S. Eliot or James Joyce, who wrote novels that were very difficult to understand even on the surface level. The nice thing about Dostoevsky is it's very easy to understand what he's writing about on the surface level. You can follow the story very easily. You can follow what the characters are saying to each other very easily. You can follow all the arguments that are being made on the surface level very easily. Now, you could spend a long time analyzing all the themes, and that would keep you quite busy, and there are a lot of complex themes in this book. But I think it's very accessible. Even to people who are not very complex, like myself. So Dostoevsky is very well respected in American universities and by the general reading public in general in America.